I've been silent about this for too long. For months, I've carried this burden alone, wrestling with whether I should share what happened that night in Jerusalem when Jesus appeared to me with an urgent warning about the rapture. Not a prediction about when it would happen, not another end times theory to add to the countless interpretations already circulating. No, what Jesus revealed was far more personal and far more urgent, a warning specifically for believers who have spent decades in the church, who have built their understanding of the end times on teachings they've trusted their entire adult lives. What he showed me will challenge everything many of you have believed about the rapture for the past 30, 40, even 50 years. It contradicts what respected prophecy teachers have taught for generations. It exposes dangerous blind spots that could leave even the most dedicated believers completely unprepared for what's actually coming. I didn't ask for this responsibility. I'm an actor, not a prophet or theologian. My role portraying Jesus in The Chosen has been the greatest honor of my career, but it didn't prepare me for an actual encounter with the living Christ or for the weight of carrying a message that many lifelong Christians may find deeply unsettling. But I can no longer remain silent. The urgency is too great, the stakes too high, and time is running out. This is what happened. It was during a private pilgrimage to Jerusalem between filming seasons of The Chosen. After days of visiting the traditional holy sites, I found myself drawn to the Garden of Gethsemane late one evening. Unlike the crowded tourist experience of daytime visits, at night the garden stands silent and solemn, its ancient olive trees, some dating back to the time of Christ, keeping their ageless vigil on the Mount of Olives. The garden was technically closed, but a kindly Franciscan monk who recognized me from the show allowed me private access, saying simply, "Sometimes God arranges special appointments in this place." His words would prove more prophetic than either of us could have imagined. Alone among those ancient trees where Jesus had agonized in prayer before his crucifixion, I felt overwhelmed by both the historical weight and spiritual significance of the place. The lights of Jerusalem's old city glimmered across the Kidron Valley, not so different from what Jesus himself might have seen 2,000 years ago. The night was cool and still, with only the occasional distant sound of traffic to remind me I wasn't actually in the first century. I found a stone bench beneath one of the largest olive trees, a gnarled giant that, according to tradition, had stood since the time of Christ. Sitting there in the darkness, I prayed for guidance about the upcoming season of filming, for wisdom in portraying Jesus faithfully, and for my own spiritual growth. What happened next defies simple explanation. The air around me changed. There's no other way to describe it. The atmosphere itself seemed to thicken, to take on substance and presence. The ambient sounds of the city faded completely, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and dimension. The darkness beneath the olive tree didn't exactly brighten, but somehow deepened with clarity, as if reality itself had come into sharper focus. And then he was there, not as a vision or a dream or a mystical impression. Jesus Christ was sitting beside me on the stone bench, as physically present as any person I've ever encountered, yet simultaneously more real than anyone I've ever met. His appearance was Middle Eastern, Jewish, historically authentic, nothing like the European depictions in religious art, and, I must admit with humility, not exactly like how I portray him in The Chosen. I'd like to say I responded with dignity or profound spiritual insight. I didn't. I nearly fell off the bench, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. Fear, awe, confusion, and disbelief warred within me as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. "Peace, Jonathan," he said, his voice both completely ordinary and utterly transcendent. "Don't be afraid." Those simple words carried such authority that my fear literally evaporated, replaced by a calm clarity unlike anything I've ever experienced. This was really happening. Jesus Christ, not the character I portrayed, but the living Lord, was sitting beside me in the Garden of Gethsemane. "You've been faithful in portraying me to this generation," he continued, "but now I need you to deliver a specific warning about the rapture. A warning especially for those who believe they understand it best." The word rapture jolted me. Like many Christians, I'd heard countless sermons, read numerous books, and seen many films about this anticipated event when Christ would return to take believers to heaven. The concept had become so familiar, so thoroughly discussed and debated, that it had almost lost its wonder and mystery. "There's a dangerous misunderstanding that has taken root among my people," Jesus said, his expression grave, "particularly among those who have studied prophecy for decades and believe they have clarity about how end-time events will unfold. This misunderstanding isn't about the timing of the rapture or its place in the prophetic timeline. It's about something far more fundamental and potentially devastating. He turned to face me directly, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. What I'm about to show you will challenge teachings that millions of believers have accepted as settled truth for their entire adult lives. Are you willing to receive this, knowing that sharing it may bring criticism and rejection from those who are most certain about their end times understanding? The weight of this question hung in the night air between us. Was I willing to receive a revelation that might contradict what respected Bible teachers had taught for generations? Was I prepared to challenge beliefs that many Christians, especially those who had followed prophecy teaching for decades, held as fundamental to their faith? Yes, Lord, I finally answered, my voice barely above a whisper. I'll receive whatever you want to show me. Then watch, he said, extending his hand toward the darkness before us. The garden dissolved around us, replaced by what I can only describe as a panoramic view of the world at the moment of the rapture. But what I witnessed was nothing like the popular depictions in books and movies. Instead of a single, instantaneous event where believers were suddenly snatched away, I saw something far more complex and nuanced unfolding across the globe. The first truth you must understand, Jesus explained as we observed this panoramic vision, is that the rapture is not primarily a physical event but a spiritual recognition. What determines whether someone participates is not their doctrinal position or denominational affiliation, but their capacity to recognize me when I call. I watched as the rapture began, and to my shock, many dedicated, lifelong Christians, people who had attended church faithfully for decades, who had read prophecy books and attended prophecy conferences, who were absolutely certain they understood how the rapture would unfold, seemed confused and hesitant when the actual moment arrived. Their hesitation wasn't because they didn't believe in the rapture. It was because the reality didn't match their expectations. The event wasn't unfolding according to the specific scenario they had been taught and had accepted as settled truth. And in that critical moment of disconnect between expectation and reality, many experienced a fatal hesitation. "This is the first warning you must deliver," Jesus said, his voice heavy with concern. "Many of my followers, especially those who have studied prophecy for decades, have developed such specific expectations about how the rapture will occur that they've lost the flexibility to recognize it if it unfolds differently than they anticipate. Their very certainty has become a vulnerability." I watched as this dynamic played out across the globe. Believers who had held their understanding of the rapture with humility and openness recognized the call immediately, regardless of whether it matched their prior expectations. But those who had become rigidly committed to specific scenarios often hesitated when reality didn't conform to those scenarios, and that hesitation had devastating consequences. "The second truth you must understand," Jesus continued, "is that spiritual recognition in that moment will not come from intellectual analysis, but from relational familiarity. Those who know me intimately will recognize my call instantly, regardless of its form. Those who know only teachings about me may miss me entirely if I don't appear as they expect." The vision shifted, and I could now see more clearly what determined whether someone recognized the rapture when it began. To my surprise, it wasn't theological precision or prophetic knowledge that made the difference. It was the quality of their ongoing relationship with Jesus himself. Believers who had cultivated daily, intimate communion with Christ recognized his presence and call immediately, even when it came in unexpected ways. Their recognition wasn't intellectual but relational, like instantly recognizing a loved one's voice on the phone without needing to analyze it. But believers who had substituted knowledge about Jesus for knowledge of Jesus often failed to recognize his call because they were looking for specific theological markers rather than responding to his familiar presence. "This is the second warning you must deliver," Jesus said. "Many who have spent decades studying what the Bible says about me have neglected the daily practice of communing with me. They know my teaching but not my voice. They recognize my titles but not my presence. And in the critical moment when immediate recognition matters most, this distinction will prove decisive." The vision expanded further, and I began to see something that deeply disturbed me. Many older believers, people who had faithfully attended church for 30, 40, or 50 years, were among those most vulnerable to missing the rapture. Not despite their decades of religious commitment, but because of how that commitment had shaped their expectations. These lifelong Christians had accumulated layer upon layer of teaching about the rapture, building such elaborate and specific expectations that they had lost the ability to recognize anything that didn't fit those expectations. Their very religious devotion had created a blind spot that younger or newer believers often didn't have. The third truth you must understand, Jesus explained, is that longevity in faith doesn't automatically create readiness for my return. In fact, decades of accumulated teaching can sometimes create rigid expectations that become barriers to recognition. Many who have walked with me the longest have developed the most specific and potentially limiting ideas about how I will come for them. I watched as this painful reality unfolded. Believers who had faithfully studied prophecy for decades, who could quote scripture about the rapture from memory, who had attended countless prophecy conferences and read shelves of books on the end times, were often the most confused when the actual event didn't match the specific scenario they had been taught to expect. "This is the third warning you must deliver," Jesus said, his voice filled with compassion. "Those who have invested the most years in studying how the rapture will occur must be the most careful not to let their accumulated expectations prevent them from recognizing it when it happens. The very certainty that feels like spiritual strength may become their greatest vulnerability." The vision shifted once more, and I could now see what was happening in the critical moments immediately following the beginning of the rapture. Spiritual entities that I instinctively recognized as demonic were moving among the hesitating believers, offering explanations and alternatives specifically designed to exploit their confusion when reality didn't match their expectations. These deceptive spirits weren't presenting obviously evil alternatives. Instead, they were offering seemingly plausible religious explanations for why the unfolding event wasn't the actual rapture explanations, specifically tailored to each believer's theological framework and prophetic understanding. "The fourth truth you must understand," Jesus said, "is that the primary deception in that moment will not be obvious evil but religious alternatives that seem to make sense of the disconnect between expectation and reality. Many will be offered seemingly biblical reasons to reject what is actually happening in favor of continuing to wait for what they've been taught to expect." I watched in horror as many dedicated believers, people who had loved Jesus and anticipated his return for decades, accepted these alternative explanations, rather than adjusting their understanding to embrace the reality that didn't match their expectations. Their very commitment to what they had been taught became the tool used to separate them from what was actually happening. "This is the fourth warning you must deliver," Jesus said, his voice urgent now. "The greatest danger in that moment will not be rejecting me entirely, but choosing to wait for a version of me that matches their expectations, rather than embracing the reality that doesn't. Many will miss the rapture not because they don't believe in it, but because they believe in it so specifically that they cannot recognize it in any other form." As the vision began to fade and the Garden of Gethsemane gradually reappeared around us, Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder. The touch was both gentle and weighty, comforting, yet conveying the seriousness of what I had just witnessed. "Jonathan," he said, "what I've shown you will be difficult for many to receive, especially those who have built their spiritual identity around specific end times expectations. But it is precisely these believers who most need this warning. Their very certainty has created vulnerability that they don't recognize." "But Lord," I protested, finding my voice at last, "why me? I'm not a prophecy expert or theologian. I'm just an actor who portrays you, who will listen to me challenging what respected Bible teachers have taught for generations." His smile contained both compassion and determination. I often choose unlikely messengers precisely because they don't come with the baggage of established prophetic authority. Those who have built ministries and reputations on specific rapture scenarios have too much invested to easily acknowledge the limitations of those scenarios. You come with no such investment, which allows people to hear the message rather than defend their position. As his visible presence began to fade, though his spiritual presence remained tangible, his final words burned themselves into my consciousness. "Tell them that certainty about how I will come can become a barrier to recognizing me when I do. Tell them that relationship with me matters more than knowledge about me. Tell them that flexibility in their expectations may be the most important preparation they can make." And then I was alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, the ancient olive trees standing silent witness to what had just occurred. The lights of Jerusalem still glimmered across the valley, but nothing else was the same. Nothing would ever be the same after what I had just witnessed. For months I've carried this burden, questioning whether to share it publicly, knowing the controversy it would inevitably provoke, especially among those who have followed prophecy teaching the longest. But I can remain silent no longer. The warning Jesus gave me about the rapture isn't just another end times theory. It's an urgent wake-up call, particularly for believers who have spent decades building elaborate expectations about how Christ's return will unfold. And this is only the beginning of what he showed me. The vision continued the following night at another location in Jerusalem, revealing even more shocking truths about the rapture that directly contradict what many lifelong Christians have been taught to expect. What Jesus showed me about the actual nature of the rapture, about who will recognize it and who will miss it, about the specific preparations believers need to make. Now these revelations will shake the foundations of conventional prophecy teaching, but they need to be shared, because according to Jesus himself, many dedicated believers, especially those who have studied prophecy the longest, are in danger of missing what they've waited for their entire lives. And time is running out. I barely slept that night. How could I? After encountering the living Christ and receiving a warning about the rapture that contradicted decades of established teaching, my mind was racing, my spirit overwhelmed. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me like a physical burden. How could I, an actor with no theological credentials, challenge beliefs that many Christians, especially those who had followed prophecy, teaching for 30, 40, or 50 years held as fundamental to their faith? As dawn broke over Jerusalem, I found myself drawn to another significant location, the Mount of Olives, where, according to Scripture, Jesus will return in glory. The mount rises east of Jerusalem's Old City, offering spectacular views across the Kidron Valley to the Temple Mount and beyond. It was from this mount that Jesus ascended to heaven after his resurrection, and angels told the disciples, "This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." I arrived as the first light of day was illuminating the ancient city, the golden dome of the rock gleaming where the temple once stood. Few tourists visit this early, so I found myself alone at a viewpoint near the Chapel of the Ascension, gazing across at the sealed eastern gate through which tradition holds the Messiah will enter Jerusalem. The irony wasn't lost on me standing at the very place associated with Christ's return, carrying a warning about how many believers might miss that return because of their rigid expectations about how it would unfold. I sat on a stone wall, watching as the rising sun gradually illuminated the old city, turning its limestone buildings from gray to gold in the morning light. "Lord," I prayed quietly, "I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry this message. The people who need to hear it most are the very ones who will likely reject it most strongly." As if in answer to my unspoken concerns, the air around me began to change, taking on that same quality of thickened presence I had experienced in Gethsemane. The early morning sounds of Jerusalem faded away, replaced by that profound, weighty silence. And then he was there again, sitting beside me on the stone wall as naturally as if we had arranged to meet for sunrise. "The hardest truths to hear," Jesus said without preamble, "are those that challenge beliefs we've held for decades. But these are often the very truths most urgently needed." Before I could respond, the Mount of Olives dissolved around us. We were once again observing that panoramic vision of the world at the moment of the rapture, but now I could see aspects of it that hadn't been revealed the previous night. "Last night I showed you how rigid expectations can prevent recognition," Jesus explained. "Tonight I will show you the actual nature of the rapture itself and why it differs so fundamentally from what many have been taught to expect for the past half-century." What I witnessed next was so contrary to popular teaching about the rapture that I found myself repeatedly shaking my head in disbelief. The neat, clean, instantaneous event depicted in books and movies where Christians simply disappear in the blink of an eye, leaving behind only empty clothes and confusion, was replaced by something far more nuanced, progressive, and spiritually complex. "The fifth truth you must understand," Jesus said, "is that the rapture is not primarily a physical evacuation but a spiritual transformation. It begins not with changed location but with changed perception, the capacity to recognize and respond to dimensions of reality that have always been present but not fully perceived." I watched as the rapture unfolded, not as a sudden disappearance but as a progressive revelation. Believers beginning to perceive and interact with spiritual reality that had always surrounded them but had previously been beyond their sensory capacity. This transformation didn't happen uniformly or instantaneously for everyone. Some experienced it immediately and completely, while for others it was more gradual, like eyes slowly adjusting to new light. This is the fifth warning you must deliver. Jesus said. Many have been taught to expect a sudden physical evacuation, here one moment, gone the next. They're waiting for a change of location when what begins is actually a change of perception. This disconnect between expectation and reality will cause many to miss the initial stages of what they've been waiting for their entire lives. The vision expanded, and I could now see more clearly how this spiritual transformation progressed. It began with heightened awareness of Christ's presence and the spiritual realm, then advanced to increased capacity to perceive and interact with that realm, and culminated in complete transformation that transcended physical limitations. But the critical initial recognition required spiritual sensitivity that many believers, especially those who had substituted theological knowledge for spiritual perception, had never developed. The sixth truth you must understand, Jesus continued, is that participation in the rapture requires spiritual capacities that many of my followers have neglected to develop. They have cultivated theological knowledge, doctrinal precision, and prophetic timelines, but have not developed the spiritual senses needed to recognize and respond to my presence when it manifests in unexpected ways. I watched as many dedicated, lifelong Christians, people who could quote scripture by chapter and verse, who had attended church faithfully for decades, who had read countless books on prophecy, struggled to recognize what was happening because they had developed their intellectual understanding of God at the expense of their spiritual perception of God. They knew the theology of divine presence but couldn't recognize the experience of it when it came in forms that didn't match their expectations. This is the sixth warning you must deliver, Jesus said. Many of my followers, particularly those who have been in the church the longest, have developed their minds but neglected their spirits. They can analyze doctrine perfectly but cannot perceive my presence accurately. And in the moment when spiritual perception matters most, this imbalance will prove devastating. The vision shifted again, and now I could see something that contradicted another fundamental aspect of popular rapture teaching. Instead of believers being completely removed from earth before any tribulation began, I saw them experiencing a spiritual transformation that actually equipped them to endure through tribulation with supernatural provision and protection. The seventh truth you must understand, Jesus explained, is that the rapture is not about removing my people from tribulation, but about transforming them to endure through tribulation. Many have been taught that I will evacuate them before any suffering begins, but the reality is that I will elevate them to a new level of spiritual capacity that enables them to experience my protection even in the midst of tribulation. I watched as transformed believers moved through increasingly challenging circumstances with supernatural peace, provision, and protection. They weren't removed from the difficulties unfolding around them, but they experienced those difficulties from a fundamentally different spiritual reality that allowed them to function as beacons of hope and agents of redemption even in the darkest moments. This is the seventh warning you must deliver, Jesus said. Many who have spent decades expecting to escape tribulation entirely will be unprepared for the reality that they are called to endure through it with transformed spiritual capacity. Their expectation of evacuation rather than elevation may cause them to miss the very transformation designed to protect them during challenging times. The implications of this revelation were staggering. For generations, many Christians, especially those influenced by popular prophecy teaching since the 1970 seconds, had been taught that the rapture would remove them from earth before any tribulation began. This expectation of escape had shaped not just their understanding of end-time events, but their entire approach to spiritual preparation. The eighth truth you must understand, Jesus continued, is that preparation for the rapture is not about being ready to leave the world, but about being ready to experience the world from a transformed spiritual reality. Many have focused on being prepared to exit when they should have focused on being prepared to elevate, to function at a higher level of spiritual capacity while still engaged with the world in tribulation. I watched as this fundamental misunderstanding played out with devastating consequences. Believers who had spent decades preparing for evacuation found themselves completely unprepared for elevation. They had developed theological frameworks for escape but had neglected the spiritual formation necessary for transformed engagement. When the rapture began as spiritual transformation rather than physical evacuation, they failed to recognize or participate in it because it contradicted their most basic expectations. This is the eighth warning you must deliver, Jesus said. The generation that has spent the longest time preparing for the rapture may be the least prepared for its reality, precisely because their preparation has been based on fundamental misconceptions about its nature and purpose. The vision expanded further, and I could now see something that shocked me even more deeply. The rapture wasn't occurring in a single, universal moment, as I had always been taught. It was unfolding as a progressive opportunity that different believers recognized and responded to at different times based on their spiritual readiness and perceptive capacity. The ninth truth you must understand, Jesus explained, is that the rapture is not a single event that happens to everyone simultaneously, but a progressive revelation that people recognize and respond to according to their spiritual preparation. Many have been taught that it will happen to all believers in the same moment, regardless of their spiritual condition, but the reality is that recognition and response depend on spiritual readiness that varies widely among my followers. I watched as this progressive nature of the rapture unfolded. Some believers recognized and responded immediately to the initial manifestation of Christ's presence. Others took longer to recognize what was happening, especially when it didn't match their expectations. And some, including many who had been absolutely certain they understood exactly how the rapture would occur, missed the opportunity entirely because they kept waiting for a version that matched their theological framework rather than responding to the reality unfolding before them. This is the ninth warning you must deliver, Jesus said. The rapture is not automatic for all who call themselves believers. It requires recognition and response that many, especially those most certain about their understanding of it, may miss entirely if they cannot adjust their expectations to embrace the reality rather than rejecting reality to preserve their expectations. As the vision continued, I witnessed something that brought tears to my eyes. Many of the believers who most quickly recognized and responded to the rapture weren't those with decades of theological education or prophetic knowledge. They were often those with simpler faith, but deeper relationship, people who knew Jesus intimately through daily communion rather than knowing about Jesus extensively through doctrinal study. The 10th truth you must understand, Jesus said, his voice gentle but firm, is that relationship trumps knowledge when it comes to spiritual recognition. Many who know the least about me theologically but know me most intimately personally will recognize me instantly when I manifest my presence. Many who know the most about me doctrinally but know me least experientially may miss me entirely if I don't conform to their theological framework. I watched as this principle played out across generations of believers. Some elderly saints who had walked with Jesus for decades in intimate daily communion recognized him instantly when he manifested, even though the experience didn't match what they had been taught to expect. Their spiritual perception, developed through years of actual relationship, overrode their theological expectations when reality contradicted those expectations. But other lifelong Christians, including many who had been respected teachers and leaders in prophecy circles, failed to recognize what was happening because they had invested more in understanding prophecy than in knowing the one about whom the prophecies were written. Their expertise had become a barrier rather than a bridge to recognition. This is the 10th warning you must deliver, Jesus said, and it may be the hardest for many to accept. Decades of accumulated knowledge about me can actually become an obstacle to recognizing me if that knowledge has created rigid expectations that I must fulfill. Many who have studied me the longest may struggle the most to recognize me if I don't appear as they have taught others to expect. As the vision began to fade and the Mount of Olives gradually reappeared around me, Jesus placed both hands on my shoulders, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Jonathan," he said, "what I've shown you directly challenges what millions of my followers, especially those who have been in the church the longest, currently believe about the rapture. Many have built their entire spiritual identity around specific expectations that this revelation contradicts. They will not easily receive this message." "Then why share it?" I asked, overwhelmed by the responsibility of challenging beliefs that had been taught as settled truth for generations. Why not let people continue in their current understanding if changing it will be so difficult? "Because false expectations create vulnerability," Jesus replied, his voice filled with urgent compassion. "Those who expect a sudden evacuation before tribulation may have their faith shattered when they find themselves experiencing tribulation. Those who expect automatic participation, regardless of spiritual condition, may miss the opportunity entirely if they cannot recognize it when it unfolds differently than they anticipated. Those who have substituted knowledge about me for relationship with me may fail to recognize me when recognition matters most." He gestured toward Jerusalem, spread out before us, the city now fully illuminated in the morning light. "There is one more aspect of the rapture you need to see, perhaps the most challenging revelation of all. Meet me tonight at the Western Wall as the sun sets." There, I will show you the most misunderstood aspect of the rapture, the truth about who will participate and who will be left behind, which will contradict the most fundamental assumptions of popular teaching. As his presence faded and the normal sounds of Jerusalem returned distant traffic, the calls of vendors setting up for the day, tourists beginning to arrive at nearby viewpoints, I sat on the stone wall, overwhelmed by what I had witnessed. The vision Jesus had given me about the rapture directly challenged core aspects of teaching that many Christians, especially those of older generations, had accepted as settled truth for decades. That the rapture is primarily physical evacuation rather than spiritual transformation. That it happens instantaneously and simultaneously for all believers. That it occurs before any tribulation begins. That participation is automatic for all who identify as Christians. That theological knowledge prepares people better than spiritual relationship. And according to Jesus, there was still more to be revealed, a final, even more challenging truth about who would participate in the rapture and who would be left behind. The weight of this revelation was almost unbearable. How could I, an actor with no theological credentials, challenge beliefs that millions of Christians, especially those who had followed prophecy teaching the longest, held as fundamental to their faith? Who would listen? Who would believe that Jesus had actually shown me these things? Yet the burden remained. The warning was too urgent, the potential consequences of false expectations too devastating to remain silent. Whatever reception this message might receive, I had to share what Jesus had shown me about the rapture. And the most challenging revelation was still to come. The day passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. After witnessing Jesus' revelations about the rapture truths that directly contradicted what millions of Christians had been taught for decades, I found myself alternating between profound certainty about what I had seen and overwhelming doubt about my role in sharing it. Who was I to challenge the end times understanding that respected Bible teachers had been promoting since before I was born? How could I tell believers who had spent 30, 40, or 50 years studying prophecy that their fundamental expectations about the rapture might actually prevent them from recognizing it when it happened? As evening approached, I made my way through Jerusalem's old city toward the Western Wall, the most sacred site in Judaism where Jews have gathered to pray for centuries. The massive limestone blocks at the base of the wall date back to the time of Herod's temple, making this one of the few places where you can literally touch stones that Jesus himself would have seen during his earthly ministry. During the day, the Western Wall Plaza bustles with activity tourists snapping photos, bar mitzvah celebrations, and devout Jews praying intensely with swaying bodies and fervent whispers. But as the sun begins to set and Sabbath approaches, a special hush falls over the area. The golden Jerusalem stone takes on a warm glow in the fading light, and the atmosphere becomes charged with centuries of prayers and expectations. I found a quiet spot toward the back of the plaza, away from the wall itself where the most devout were praying. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ancient stones, I reflected on the profound irony of receiving revelations about Christian expectations for the Messiah's return at the very place where Jewish expectations for the Messiah's first coming had often created barriers to recognition. 2,000 years ago, many devout Jews had missed Jesus' first coming precisely because it didn't match their theological expectations. Now, according to what Jesus had shown me, many devout Christians were in danger of missing his return for exactly the same reason. Expectations so specific and rigid that they couldn't recognize reality when it unfolded differently. As the last direct sunlight faded from the plaza and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Jerusalem, the air around me began to change, taking on that now familiar quality of thickened presence. The sounds of prayers at the wall, the distant street noise from the old city, the conversations of lingering tourists all faded to that profound silence that seemed to have substance and weight. And then Jesus was sitting beside me, his presence both utterly natural and completely overwhelming. "This place," he said, gesturing toward the Western Wall, "represents both the power and the danger of religious expectation. For centuries, the most devout Jews have prayed here for Messiah to come, yet many failed to recognize me when I arrived because I didn't match their expectations. The same danger now faces my church as they wait for my return." Before I could respond, the Western Wall Plaza dissolved around us. We were once again observing that panoramic vision of the world at the moment of the rapture, but now I could see aspects of it that hadn't been revealed in the previous visions. "Tonight I will show you the most challenging truth of all," Jesus said, The reality about who will participate in the rapture and who will be left behind, a truth that contradicts the most fundamental assumptions of popular teaching. What I witnessed next was so contrary to conventional understanding of the rapture that I found myself repeatedly gasping in disbelief. The neat division between saved and unsaved that most rapture teaching presents, with all born-again believers taken and all unbelievers left behind, was replaced by something far more nuanced and spiritually discerning. The 11th truth you must understand, Jesus explained, is that participation in the rapture is not determined by a past profession of faith, but by present capacity for spiritual recognition and transformation. Many who made decisions decades ago but have not developed their spiritual perception will find themselves unable to recognize or respond when the opportunity comes. I watched as this devastating reality unfolded across the global church. Many who had prayed salvation prayers years or decades earlier but had never progressed beyond that initial decision, who had never cultivated genuine relationship with Jesus or developed their capacity for spiritual perception, found themselves unable to recognize what was happening when the rapture began as spiritual transformation rather than physical evacuation. This is the 11th warning you must deliver, Jesus said, his voice heavy with concern. Many of my followers, particularly those who have been in the church the longest, have built their assurance of rapture participation on a decision they made decades ago rather than on a relationship they've developed daily. They assume their past profession guarantees future participation, regardless of their present spiritual condition. The vision expanded, and I could now see more specifically what determined whether someone participated in the rapture. It wasn't their theological position on when it would occur. It wasn't their denominational affiliation or doctrinal precision. It wasn't even the sincerity of their past profession of faith. It was their present capacity to recognize Jesus' presence and respond to his call, a capacity developed through ongoing relationship rather than preserved through past decision. The 12th truth you must understand, Jesus continued, is that many who are absolutely certain they will participate in the rapture will be left behind, not because they weren't sincere in their faith, but because they developed the wrong kind of spiritual preparation. They prepared their minds with knowledge about me rather than preparing their spirits to recognize me. I watched as this painful reality played out across generations of believers, many who had attended church faithfully for decades, who had accumulated extensive knowledge about the Bible and prophecy, who had lived morally upright lives and supported Christian causes, found themselves unable to participate in the rapture because they had never developed the spiritual perception necessary to recognize Christ's presence when it manifested in unexpected ways. This is the 12th warning you must deliver, Jesus said, and it will be the hardest for many to accept. Decades of religious activity, biblical knowledge, and moral living do not automatically create the spiritual capacity needed for rapture participation. Many lifelong Christians have developed religious habits without developing spiritual perception, and in the moment when perception matters most, habits will not be sufficient. The implications of this revelation were staggering. For generations, many Christians had been taught that the rapture was essentially automatic for all who had prayed a salvation prayer, that their participation was guaranteed by past decision rather than dependent on present condition. This understanding had shaped not just their expectations about the rapture, but their entire approach to spiritual development. The 13th truth you must understand, Jesus explained, is that preparation for the rapture requires specific spiritual development that many of my followers have neglected. They have assumed that general Christian living would automatically prepare them for this event, but the reality is that it requires focused cultivation of spiritual capacities that many, especially those who have substituted religious knowledge for spiritual experience, have never developed. The vision shifted to show me the specific spiritual capacities that enabled rapture participation, capacities that many lifelong Christians had never intentionally developed because they hadn't realized their importance. The capacity to recognize divine presence even when it manifests in unexpected ways. The ability to trust spiritual perception over intellectual analysis when they conflict. The flexibility to adjust theological expectations when reality contradicts them. The willingness to embrace spiritual transformation even when it challenges religious identity. The courage to follow divine guidance even when it contradicts respected religious voices. This is the 13th warning you must deliver, Jesus said. Many of my followers, particularly those who have been in the church the longest, have never developed these specific spiritual capacities because they didn't know they needed them. They have developed other valuable spiritual qualities, but not the particular capacities required for recognizing and responding to the rapture when it unfolds differently than expected. As the vision continued, I witnessed something that brought both hope and urgency. These critical spiritual capacities could be developed relatively quickly if believers recognized their importance and focused intentionally on cultivating them. The problem wasn't that people couldn't develop these capacities, it was that most didn't even realize they needed to because conventional teaching about the rapture had never emphasized their importance. The 14th truth you must understand, Jesus said, is that there is still time for my people to develop the spiritual capacities needed for rapture participation. But this development must become their highest priority. Many have spent decades focusing on the wrong kind of preparation because they misunderstood the nature of the event they were preparing for. I watched as believers who recognized this truth began intentionally developing the specific spiritual capacities needed for rapture participation. They practiced recognizing divine presence in their daily lives, learning to discern the subtle ways Jesus manifested himself beyond their religious expectations. They deliberately cultivated the ability to trust spiritual perception, even when it contradicted intellectual analysis. They intentionally held their theological frameworks with humility and flexibility, rather than rigid certainty. This is the 14th warning you must deliver, Jesus said. Tell my people that they must shift their preparation from intellectual understanding about the rapture to spiritual capacity for the rapture. Tell them that what they need most urgently is not more information about when and how it will happen, but more development of their ability to recognize and respond when it does. The vision expanded one final time, and I could now see the ultimate outcome of these different approaches to rapture preparation. Believers who recognize the importance of developing specific spiritual capacities, even if they made this shift late in life after decades of different focus, were able to participate in the rapture when it began. Their intentional development of spiritual perception enabled them to recognize Christ's presence even when it manifested in ways that contradicted their previous expectations. Conversely, believers who continued focusing exclusively on intellectual understanding of the rapture, accumulating more prophetic knowledge, refining their end times timelines, debating pre-tribulation versus mid-tribulation views, often missed the actual event entirely because they had developed the wrong kind of preparation. Their extensive knowledge about the rapture had not created the spiritual capacity to recognize it when it happened differently than they expected. The final truth you must understand, Jesus said, his voice filled with both urgency and compassion, is that the greatest danger facing my church regarding the rapture is not lack of information but misplaced preparation. Many have prepared extensively for an event they've misunderstood, developing capacities that won't serve them when the actual moment arrives. As the vision began to fade and the Western Wall Plaza gradually reappeared around me, Jesus placed both hands on my shoulders, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Jonathan," he said, "what I've shown you will challenge the most fundamental assumptions about the rapture that millions of my followers, especially those who have been in the church the longest, have built their spiritual lives around. Many will resist this message because accepting it would require them to acknowledge that decades of preparation may have been focused in the wrong direction. But Lord," I protested, "how can I convince people who have studied prophecy for 30, 40, or 50 years that they might have misunderstood something so fundamental? Who will believe me over teachers they've trusted their entire adult lives?" "Some won't," Jesus acknowledged. "Some are so invested in their current understanding that they cannot receive anything that challenges it, even when that challenge comes from me. But others, many others, have felt increasing unease about conventional rapture teaching. They've sensed that something is missing in how it's been presented. They've noticed the disconnect between the intellectual focus of popular prophecy teaching and the relational, transformational focus of my ministry. These are the ones who will recognize truth in what you share." He gestured toward the Western Wall, where devout Jews continued their prayers, many still waiting for a Messiah who had already come but hadn't matched their expectations. "The greatest tragedy in spiritual history," Jesus said, "is not that people reject truth they recognize, but that they fail to recognize truth because it doesn't match their expectations. This happened with my first coming, and without this warning, it will happen again with my return." As his presence began to fade and the normal sounds of Jerusalem returned, prayers at the wall, distant street noise, conversations of lingering tourists. His final words echoed not just in my ears, but in the depths of my spirit. Tell them that it's not too late to shift their preparation. Tell them that developing spiritual perception is more urgent than refining prophetic timelines. Tell them that flexibility in their expectations may be the most important quality they can cultivate. Tell them that relationship with me matters more than knowledge about me when it comes to recognizing my presence. And then I was alone at the Western Wall as night settled fully over Jerusalem. The weight of revelation pressed down on me like a physical burden. For 3 consecutive nights, Jesus Christ himself had shown me truths about the rapture that directly contradicted what millions of believers, especially those who had followed prophecy teaching the longest, had accepted as settled truth. That participation depends on present spiritual capacity, not just past profession. That many lifelong Christians might miss it despite their certainty of inclusion. That specific spiritual capacities most haven't developed are essential for participation. That there is still time to develop these capacities, but it must become highest priority. The implications were staggering. The very believers who thought themselves most prepared for the rapture, those who had studied prophecy for decades and built their spiritual identity around specific end times expectations, might actually be among the least prepared, because they had developed the wrong kind of preparation. As I made my way back through Jerusalem's old city, navigating the ancient stone streets now illuminated by soft golden lamps, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The warning Jesus had given me about the rapture wasn't just another end times theory. It was an urgent wake-up call, particularly for believers who had spent decades building elaborate expectations about how Christ's return would unfold. I don't know how this message will be received. I don't know who will listen and who will dismiss it, but I do know that I can no longer remain silent. Jesus warned me about the rapture, and what he said will wake you up if you're willing to hear it. Not because I claim any special authority or prophetic insight, but because the warning addresses the very assumptions that might prevent you from recognizing the event you've waited for your entire life. The question isn't whether you believe my experience, but whether you're willing to examine your own expectations and preparation. Are you developing the spiritual capacities needed to recognize Christ's presence even if it manifests differently than you've been taught to expect? Are you holding your prophetic understanding with humility and flexibility? Are you cultivating relationship with Jesus himself more diligently than you're accumulating knowledge about him? Your participation in the rapture may depend on how you answer these questions, regardless of how long you've been in church or how certain you are about your current understanding. It's time to wake up.